Good evening, friends. As you can see, I'm not Manu Pillai, but I'm a fellow Malayali. So I hope to fill his young boots here. Welcome, Amitav. It's always great to have you back at the Kolkata Literary Meet. And this is your third visit here. And I hope we continue this wonderful journey together. So the topic is 2020 Vision, Reading and Writing India. So when I thought about the topic, I thought I'd ask you first about your personal journey. The last decade ended on a wonderful high with the Gyanpith and Gun Island. So when you look at the novel you wrote at the cusp of 2019-20, how is that different from the author of 2000, say?
Well, first of all, let me say it's a great pleasure to be here. It always is. And thank you very much for inviting me. And it's great to be up here speaking with you. So what's different between 2000 and 2020? In the year 2000, I published The Glass Palace, which has had its own extraordinary career. And in 2019, I published Gun Island, and they're completely different books, really. And I think the difference between them is really, in large part, a difference in the time, Between 2020 and 2000, there's been such an incredible acceleration, such an incredible acceleration in the way that the world goes around, that I think it's impossible not to respond to these changes. As you know, just before I published Gun Island, I published another book called The Great Derangement. It's called Climate Change and the Unthinkable. And I think that's really the reality that has reared its head above us now, that we suddenly recognize that, we are facing a moment in time like our species has never known. A crisis on a level which humanity has never before confronted. So how will we respond to that? How will the world respond to that? It's kind of hard to say. But certainly I do think that, this is a challenge that exists also in literature, in imagination and the arts.
So if you could talk us through that, because there is a part in The Great Derangement where you talk about the presence of natural calamities and climatic upheavals in our lives, but it never finds its way into works of writing. So did you mentally or subconsciously take up that challenge? So is Gun Island a child of the great derangement, a fictional child of the truth of the great derangement?
Well, in many ways, the Great Derangement for me really began in 2000, which is when I started working on The Hungry Tide. And The Hungry Tide, as you know, is set in the Sundarban. And it was after I started writing the book that I started spending a lot of time in the Sundarban. And even way back in 2000, the effects of climate change were already visible. In that area, you could see the impacts on the lives of the people who live in the forest. And since then, this has accelerated. More and more people are being displaced by rising sea levels, by increasing salinity, by cyclones and so on. Now, one thing that has to be said here is that in Bangla writing and in Indian fiction, let's say of the mid-20th century, these issues had a huge place. If you think of so many writers like Adwaita Mallobormon or Mahashetadi, so many writers were deeply engaged with issues of the environment, with issues of just the reality that we inhabit. I think that consciousness really started fading somewhere strangely, maybe in the 1980s, 1990s, even though, of course, even at that time, Mahashetadi was very much, in the prime of her life and so on. But if you look today at the sort of fiction that's being produced, not just in India but around the world, you'll see that it's overwhelmingly a kind of urban fiction. A fiction that's really not responding to um, these sorts of challenges. And I think that really does have to change and will change and is changing.
It's interesting you're talking about, the preponderance of authors about the urban life, and through that the internal life, the loneliness that in many ways pervades the urban life. So I happened to be speaking to Perumal Murugan 2 weeks ago, and he was talking about his one of his rare works of non-fiction, which was called Amma, which is about his mother. And reading through it, was I was in conversation with him, I was struck at how bonded each story was to the land. He was primarily talking about his mother, but because the life he was describing sprung out of the crop seasons and cycles. Her life was about going and collecting jaggery for the whole year, for collecting castor oil for the whole year. So there was a deep link between nature and their lives. Now we have lost that. So, in many ways, do you think it is unreasonable to expect writers who sit in desks, present company exempted, but in Brooklyn and London and Bombay and Delhi, to really engage with nature to that extent? Because that's not their reality anymore.
Look, I don't think that's the case. I mean, it's those writers and artists may think that they're unimpacted by nature, but they're not. I mean, look, Mumbai, let's just take the case of Mumbai. Mumbai has had these 3 or 4 absolute climate disasters in the last 20 years. These incredible rain bomb events that happened in 2008 and again in 2012. And there'll be many more of those.
New York as well has had.
New York as well. Hurricane Sandy devastated New York and its surrounding regions. So it's by no means the case that that writers who live in cities are not impacted by climate change, or by really, I think it's rather limiting, in fact, to talk about it solely as a question of climate change. Because, as Margaret Atwood has famously said, it's not just climate change, it's everything change. That's what we are really seeing. Because, say, in the case of Mumbai, as well as in the case of Chennai, Chennai again has been hit by these terrible rain bomb events and floods and so on. But in all these cases, what we see is that the impacts of climate are hugely magnified by things like corruption, by bad politics, bad governance, bad planning, terrible building codes, and so on. And that's true across the world. I mean, it's been true also in a city like Houston in America, which is the 4th largest city in America. They've been hit again and again by these devastating floods, which are always compounded by bad planning, by the relaxation of certain kinds of codes about where people can build. So, yes, I think writers who live in cities are completely impacted by these events. Why then do these events not show up in their work? I think that's really the question. It's not that they're not impacted by these events. It's what is the mental or imaginative process that prevents them from recognizing the reality that surrounds them.
So, do you think you've mentioned that has been conspicuous by its absence in the last decade, or since 2020, 2000, when a lot of these climate change related storms and superstorms and floods have happened. Looking forward, would you say that you would expect younger writers, the generation of Greta, who's taken up this so significantly, to actually embrace stories where nature and man confront each other in a way, or where the world around us, the natural world around us, kind of finally makes its way into our stories? Do you think the new generation can do that?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely started already. I mean, I see every sign of it. Many of you will have heard of Extinction Rebellion, which has been very powerful in London and so on. But allied to Extinction Rebellion is a movement called Writers Rebel, and it's about writers, trying to make statements about these issues. And, it's very gratifying for me that they treat The Great Derangement as one of their sort of inspirational texts. So yes, I think it is changing, and I think it's going to continue to change.
So, moving away from your concerns about climate change and the Anthropocene, uh, is the next Amitav Ghosh novel going to be about something totally different from Gun Island? Or
Yes,
are we going to see those youngsters in that boat coming into Venice and
the next novel is quite a long way off. At the moment, I'm trying to finish some other books, so those are actually at the forefront of my mind right now.
so you're famously secretive about your next books. So any clues?
Yeah, but I'm secretive about books when
Are you
when they're not finished.
superstitious about them, or is it just
Yes, I am superstitious. I think that it's very bad luck to talk about a book that you haven't finished. But in this instance, the books are more or less finished, so I can certainly talk about them. The first one, which is going to be out in June, actually, is an adaptation of an episode from the legend of Bon Bibi. So it's the legend of
which
that.
was there in the Hungry Tide as well?
Yes, it's there in the Hungry Tide. So it's an extension of it. I translated parts, or rather, I adapted. For the Hungry Tide, I translated parts of the Bon Bibi Johuranama. But in this book, I've adapted actually that whole episode, and I've adapted it in verse. So as for the Bangla Mongol Kabbo, the predominant sort of verse meter in the Mongol Kabbo is a meter called Dvipodi Poyar, So I've translated, my adaptation is actually also in Dvipodi Poyar, in English.
So is it a novel in verse?
No, it's nothing like that. It is in verse. I mean, the adaptation is in verse, but it's not. I wouldn't call it a novel. It's an adaptation of a folk story, if you like. In a way, the Bon Bibi Johuranama is like a Mongol Kabbo, except that the Mongol Kabbos were written 4 or 5 centuries ago, and these were mainly written in the late 19th century. And the main Bon Bibi Johuranama, there are 2 versions of it, were both written by Muslim writers, And it's very interesting to see how they're written, because the actual Johuranama is written not as you would write a Bangla text, opening from, from right to left. It's the other way around. It opens like an Arabic text. It opens from left to right. And the text flows from left to right. And in fact, the first part of both the Johuranama are about, Bon Bibi's birth and so on, which is all set in Makkah, Medina, So Bon Bibi is said to have come to Bengal from Makkah, Medina. Her father is a pir who is a Sufi saint and so on, who ultimately sends her to settle the Sundarban. So it's a very interesting kind of. It's a form of hybridity which is even more developed than is normally the case in Bengal. But anyone who's read, for example, the ballads of Bengal, you'll see this kind of hybridity within the text has always existed. But what was very interesting for me was especially to work with this verse meter, Dvipadi Poyar, which is actually in its own way a very demanding kind of meter, because it consists of 2 12-syllable lines, But these two lines together become a couplet of 24 syllables. But each line also has a caesura or break in the middle. And the caesura is very interesting because it's very important for the chanting, you know. So to adapt that into English with the same syllabic count and the same pattern of rhyme was incredibly interesting. And, you know, I think it's very important to translate these texts like these into verse, you know, because they were never meant to be prose. I mean, our devotional literature was never written in prose. I mean, in fact, they say that in Bangla we didn't actually have any prose until the 19th century, you know. And, you know, it was interesting to listen to these speakers talking about the Mahabharata because, of course, you know, B.N. Ganguly's great translation also exists and has done since the early 20th century. But you know, what's very interesting is that Ganguly's text was in prose. Every major translation of the Mahabharata, except for Carol Satyamurthy's recent version, which is in blank verse, but every major translation is actually in prose. And I think texts like that, you know, to have them in verse puts them in a completely different part of your brain. It puts it in a completely different part of your mind.
But what was the challenge of doing this? It must have been a tremendous challenge of keeping a rhythmic pattern and
it's very, very difficult. It's very time consuming. It's very difficult because at the same time you're working towards trying to keep the narrative. You're trying to keep the meaning, but you're also trying to keep the rhythm and the rhyme and so on. So it is incredibly challenging, and you can see that you know, to translate the Mahabharata into verse would be not the work of one generation, but of you know, millions of people.
So does this work have a name, or are you too superstitious to kind of give us the name of your next work?
No, it absolutely has a name. It's called Jungle Nama.
Jungle Nama. Okay.
Jongul Nama.
Jongul Nama.
Yeah.
Okay. So you heard about it first here on this stage, or have you tweeted it out?
I have.
Oh dear, I'm not on Twitter, so I'm sorry that bit of information.
It's also on Instagram and so on.
All the forms of media and communication I have
so it's
little connection to.
It's not a secret.
Yes.
But let me say that it's actually going to appear first as a, you know, as a illuminated manuscript. So I'm working with an artist who's going to illuminate the manuscript. I hate the word illustrated. I think illuminated is a much better word. But then there's going to be a graphic novel as well. And the graphic novel will appear in December.
So you're working double time in 2020. So this is version 2 of Amitav. 2 books in a year.
Yes, you might say that. But, you know, I said in The Great Derangement that I think we have to look towards new forms. You know, we have to look towards ways of bringing together word and image, you know, as illuminated texts. So it's very exciting for me to be doing this.
It's interesting you've spoken about this folk, you know, this translation you're doing of this old work which you had earlier engaged with 20 years ago. Because my next question is about a little introspective question about festivals like ours, where, again, present company and all our English writing guests exempted. But do you think we all could do more for regional, for other Indian languages? Because again, during my interaction with Murugan sir, he said regional is not the word. It has to be other Indian languages. Do you think there is enough happening in translations? Do you think the coming decade should see more happening where translations are direct from, say, Tamil to Bengali, from Bangla to Gujarati without the intermediary of Hindi or English?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think we could never have enough by way of translation, you know. I mean, I think it's very, very important that we have more and more translations. But there again, let me say that, you know, the situation today is so completely different from 40 years ago when I started publishing. I mean, today there are major publishers. There's hardly a major publisher that doesn't have a translation wing. You know, HarperCollins has a major series of translations. Penguin India has a major series of translations. Westland has a huge series of translations. So, what has actually happened in these last 20 or 30 years is that translation has been professionalized, which is exactly what it should be. So we have access to more and more texts.
But it's to English.
They are to English, but the other way of translation from, let's say, Bangla to Malayalam has existed forever. I mean, when I was in Kerala, I'm always very struck by that everyone thinks that, Sharat Chandra
Yes,
is
many
a Malayali
Malayalis
writer.
think Devdas was
Yes.
was a Bengali novel. That could also be
No,
because
they
he
think
was was a Malayalam novel. Because I think because it's got an alcoholic hero. So yes, it has existed, but it was always through the intermediary. Apparently, Devdas was directly translated. This is what
Yes.
an author told me once, from
Is that so?
Bangla to Malayalam. I don't know who did it, but apparently there was no via English in that particular one.
You may be right. I think actually, the extraordinary thing is that Sharat Babu's work has a kind of extraordinary pan-Indian universality. I mean, just as you say that, Malayalis think of Devdas as a Malayalam text, uh, the same is true in Gujarat. In many other parts of the country, you'll find that people will say that. They think of it as a text which was composed in their language. Which is something that nobody would say of, let's say, Robi Thakur's work, It's kind of a curious thing that way. I mean, there is a kind of plasticity about Sharat Babu's narratives, which allow them to be sort of adapted, into other languages very easily.
Yes, but coming back to modern writing in vernaculars, do you think enough is done? Do you notice any writers from other vernaculars who you have read in translation?
I've read in translation for a long time, but I think it also often depends on the quality of the translation. I think our great loss was A.K. Ramanujan. Ramanujan was really, to my mind, the gold standard of translation. I mean, his translations of Sangam poetry, his translations of Kannada poetry are just transcendent. I mean, they're works of just utter genius. Similarly, I would say that his translation of Samskara, U.R. Anantamurthy's novel, really made that novel, I mean, so influential, within Indian literature. His death was a terrible, terrible loss for us. But again, we have very gifted young translators. I think Orunabu Sinha is a wonderful translator. So, there's a process of winnowing where we discover,
Now, before I throw it open to the audience who invariably have many, many questions, uh, if you had to choose a couple of writers whom you are excited about under 45, let's say, in the Indian writing firmament, who would you name?
Well, I just recently read a wonderful book by a young a writer who I've known for a long time, actually, because she was once she helped me with some of the research for Sea of Poppies. Her name is Megha Mojumdar, and she's actually from Kolkata, and she's written a wonderful book which is going to be out very soon, and I think you will all find it very exciting to read.
Okay. And the other part of the session description was reading India. So I mean, the reading habit globally, we cannot beat ourselves up as Indians only, is in some risk, we hear, though Waterstones claims that, sales are again on the way up. So does it worry you that the young have less time to read and more media and digital apps and games to play?
It worries me a lot. Absolutely. I think young people, especially of the generation of the, who are now in their teens and 20s, their ways of interacting with the with the word are completely different from what it was in our time. They interact mainly through mobile phones. What that means is that they have much shorter attention spans. They're not able to, really to deal often with longer texts. But at the same time, it's also true that what James Daunt says, that the sale, the gross sale of books has not gone down. In fact, it's gone up. So the audience for books is also expanding. But I do think that especially the mobile phone has so profoundly changed all our habits that we can't expect it not to change our habits of reading.
Okay. So on that slightly somber note, are there any questions for Amitav? Of course there are. We'll start, I can't see at the back, but there's this young gentleman here. I can hear silence all over.
Hello, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, but speak up a bit.
Okay, you were talking about the climate change in the first part. So I just want to ask you that it is really a thing to worry, or it just we are overconscious because the mainstream media is so defocused about it. There is hardly any novel is writing about climate change, or hardly any movies about it. Apart from your book, The Great Derangement, there is hardly anyone is writing about the climate change in today. So it's really a thing to worry, sir, or it's just we are overconscious?
You should absolutely be worried. You should be panicked. I mean, this is not a faraway disaster. It's unfolding around us. Look at what's happening in Australia. Just look at these wildfires. I mean, this is a very rich country and so on. Look at these wildfires. It's coming at people at these incredible rates. In Bengal, the thing that we are most vulnerable to is intensification of cyclones. We were very lucky that the recent cyclone Bulbul actually missed making a direct hit on Kolkata. You can never forget that Kolkata is a city below sea level. So it will just take one major event like a cyclone to really send half the city underwater. You should be very, very worried because the greatest natural disasters of the 20th century were all in the Bay of Bengal region. The Bhola cyclone of 1970 killed, people think, as many as 1 million people. And it also precipitated the Bangladesh war and so on. So we should be literally in a state of panic about what is happening. But again, let me say, it's not just climate change. Look, I'll tell you, one of the most important effects that we see in recent years is this enormous demographic shift that's happening across India. So that you'll have read how this slum colony in Bangalore was demolished, and it was found that they were all actually Indian Bengalis and Assamese. So, if you go to to the west coast now, if you go to, say, Goa, or you go to Karnataka, or you'll see that the entire working class of those regions is Bengali. Either Bengali or from Chhattisgarh or from Orissa. The great majority of these people are people who've been displaced by sea level rise. Cyclone Aila had an absolutely disastrous impact on the Sundarban. Hundreds of thousands of people had to migrate because, so much salt water came in, so much water drowned cultivable land that people had to leave, in the hundreds of thousands. So don't be deceived by the mainstream media's silence on this. These enormous changes are unfolding around us, and they're manifesting in politics. You can't forget that, the destabilization of the world's major democracies is coming around because of demographic changes. And these changes are only going to accelerate. So everything you see around you today, whether it takes a political form or an economic form or whatever form it takes, in the end, it's happening within the envelope of climate change.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I can see a hand at the back. We'll get to you later. I can see two hands right now. This gentleman here.
So, sir, the thing that, along with climate risk, the thing that we see in the third world that is rising is the communal politics. So, speaking of communal politics, I have been to Canning a few days back, and I remember reading about Canning, the incident of Henry Piddington warning the British about building of the Canning port. And you also mentioned the incident of, in your next work on Bono Bibi. So I saw that several temples dedicated to Bono Bibi have been renamed as Bono Devi. So do you see this as as an attempt to Hinduize the context of culture or religion that has been practiced in Sundarban?
Look, it's a very complicated question. I think one of the things that you also have to deal with here is that the Bonobibi devotion, which existed among Muslims also, has been also very much suppressed by Islamic orthodoxy. You know, so there is a kind of a dual process going on here. So there is an attempt, as you say, to rename Bonbibi as Bonodevi. You know, culture and religion and belief systems, they're not static. They change all the time. And this is normal. So we can't expect, we can't point to one form and say, this is the original, you must only accept this, you must only practice this. You know, I'm certainly not in that position. I don't think anyone is in that position to say that. And in this particular instance, to me, what is interesting is I wonder where it'll go. Because actually, when you get to the Bonbibit Johuranama, how will they interpret these early parts of the Johuranama, which all begin in Makkah Medina? You know, how will those be rewritten, as it were? It's kind of curious to try and conceive of it.
Right at the back, I can see.
Good evening, sir.
Yes.
I would like to take this opportunity to ask.
Please hold the mic close.
Please speak a
Yeah.
little loudly. I can't hear you, actually.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah.
I would like to take this opportunity to ask a question more related to the world of fiction that you've created. So, in your books, your books are replete with very intricately built characters which we get attached to, and some of them you very remorselessly kill off. And especially in the Glass Palace, we see too many of them die. So, how tough is it
You're
for
the
you?
psychopathic author who's killing off people.
How tough for you is it to kill a character who you've built with so much intricate detail?
Well, the short answer to that is that it's very tough. It's one of the worst things that you do as a writer is that, you know, you live with that character. The character really is to you another human being. And, you know, it's not the case that the writer is like a puppet master who dictates, you know, what the character is going to do. The character has their own agency and their own ways of, you know, being in the world and acting in the world. And sometimes it's necessary that they end. I mean, because you can't see a way forward for them. When I kill off a character, it's only with the greatest reluctance, I can tell you that. And sometimes they come alive again, you know.
So the mother going from Burma to doing that long trek, she dies on the way. Is that the character you were concerned about in Glass Palace? Or is it somebody from... Who is the character you're particularly worried about?
Well, Saya John was an elderly man and, you know, he'd lived a difficult
He'd lived
life.
his life, yes. I felt sad
Yeah.
about the mother.
Yeah, the mother was, I mean, that was a terrible, it was just wrenching. But then again, you know, this long march from Burma to Bengal in 1941 to 42, it was a terrible event. I mean, who knows how many people died on it? I mean, people who set off on that march, I would say that it's probably, the death toll was probably, you know, 30-40%. So many people died, you know. And I mean, people who lived through that march talked always about seeing dead bodies by the roadside, seeing dead people everywhere. So, you know, certain events you can't write about without confronting the horror of that event, you know. That's just the reality, in a way.
So what does the author do when a favorite character is dead in his or her novel? So when Sinta, for instance, in the novel you've just released, or the novel we all talk about, The Shadow Lines, when the protagonist dies. So do you go and have a drink or...
Well, I think that would be a very good response.
A kind of mental funeral and
Yeah, it does feel like there is certainly a process of grieving, and it takes some. It's a very. I mean, those pages are very difficult to write.
that's a wonderful question. I must thank the young man. Anybody else?
Yeah, I see two questions.
I can see a lady there. We'll come back. We've got time. So that she's near the mic. There are two ladies. One has the mic, yes.
Good evening, sir.
Yes.
With the rapid industrialization and the population expansion, these pressures are mainly found in the low-lying areas, especially in areas like Kolkata and Mumbai. So, what action do you propose that the government take to deal with such problems? Since setting up of industries, embankments, dams are very essential parts of industrialization.
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is try to think about what kind of economy leads to a good life. And I don't think it's necessarily the case that, a very highly industrialized economy is always the best kind of way to live. We have to try and think of, in what ways can people lead good and fulfilling lives. And, when I think of my grandparents' generation, yes, I mean, there were many things they didn't have. But in many ways, their lives were more fulfilling than the lives of today. So I don't think we should feel trapped into thinking that there's only one road. That was the real success of neoliberalism. That's, the kind of neoliberal thing that started with Margaret Thatcher saying there is no alternative. As we can see, this endless industrialization is also not an alternative, simply because the natural systems will not support it. Natural systems are breaking down everywhere around the world. We have to think of another way. We have to think of other ways of doing things. I'm not an economist, I'm not a planner, but I can see that what we have is not working, that this path is not a sustainable path, that we can't go along this path, and we certainly cannot go along this path in parts of the world like Bengal, which is actually the most densely populated part of the world. If you think of the Bengal Delta, it's not such a large region, but it has it's something like 250 million people, squeezed into this one area. And now that we are confronting sea level rise, we are looking at just so many systems breaking down. I mean, just think of the arsenic in the drinking water. How are we going to address just simple issues like that? I mean, after all, human beings can manage like a day or two without food. They can't manage a single day without water. This is the absolute stark reality that we are confronting across this country.
There's a lady here. Can you see just below the lights?
Hi. Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I can hear myself, so you can hear me. Good evening, and thank you for this opportunity to be able to pose a question to you.
Thank you.
I have two queries. One is pertaining to environment, and the other with writing. The first is we do not have an equivalent voice of a Jane Goodall or David Attenborough. You are amongst possibly the loudest, that is heard on this topic. We don't have an organized voice, even for political parties when they're campaigning. Nobody is talking. We are addressing GDPs. We are talking about women's empowerment and other issues. Environment is not even on the agenda per se, on anybody's minds, even as citizens. So how do you think that there can be a more concerted effort to make a representation or policy making, even to do with plastic? No matter how much we ban single-use plastic, if fossil fuel is alive and petroleum is alive and its secondary byproducts are alive and it's the cheapest way to make it, even though people may go about upcycling bags or making jute bags, they are not, they are not really making a dent. How do you think this can be addressed? And second is, now that you're in town, would you consider a workshop? Is it part of the agenda to conduct a workshop for aspiring and hopeful writers of the city? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, a very interesting, very important and interesting questions. Look, you're absolutely right. In our country, we've not really had that kind of powerful voice speaking on these issues. Though Arundhati Roy, to her great credit, has been addressing environmental questions since the time of the Narmada Bachao Andolan. But again, you're right. I mean, these the more sort of like day-to-day issues are not being addressed. I'll give you an example. You know, in 2016, when my book The Great Derangement came out, I was in Delhi, and at that point, the Bundelkhand and central India had been going through this absolutely epic drought. You know, hundreds of thousands of people leaving Bundelkhand every week to travel to the cities. Now, you know, this is an unfolding disaster on an almost unimaginable scale. You know, a whole part of the land of our country that was once productive will never be productive again. Just think about that. I mean, the long-term effects of this drought. At that time, I was very struck. Parliament had only one session on the drought, and less than 10% of the members of Parliament attended. You know, they just had no interest. These issues don't seem to affect their vote. They don't seem to affect their vote banks. So what can you say? I mean, you know, when we look around the world today, and it's not just India, everywhere you look, the first thing we have to notice is that the globe's political systems have failed it. Our political systems have failed on a scale that is almost beyond our understanding, you know. So how can we expect this political system, which is built upon fantasies about growth and about GDP, to answer these questions? And you know, I'm not a planner, I'm not an economist, I'm a writer. And I can tell you that the first thing that increasingly interests me about these issues is that, you know, in your question, you used a very interesting turn of phrase. You said fossil fuels are alive. And, you know, I think I really want you to sort of try and think about what that means, fossil fuels are alive. Because we think of fossil fuels as dead, you know. We think of them as something that's inert, something that has no inherent life of its own. But this is the uncanny possibility that you have to think of, that fossil fuels are living things. We find now that we can't get rid of fossil fuels. It's not as easy as just saying, okay, we'll switch over to electric. Fossil fuels have a certain kind of agency. They have a hold upon us through plastic, through the ways in which they make our lives possible. So, you know, just to think that, you know, that these things of the earth that we use, that they were inert, that they had no entanglement with us, that they were just tools that we could use. This is our greatest delusion. These are not tools. Fossil fuels will not be put aside. They have their own power, their own strength, and they're asserting it over us right now.
And what about the workshop?
The workshop. Alas, it's not going to work this time or in the foreseeable future.
Keep your request.
But maybe someday.
Someday, yes. We have time for one question.
There are two back there.
Okay, we'll take them together and then you can answer. I can actually see 4 hands, but whoever's closer to the mic. And very quickly, yes.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
It is an honor to be speaking to you in person.
Thank you.
So, we have seen that young voices like that of Greta Gerwig are coming out all around the world. There are school strikes for climate change in the world today. And I was really struck by that young girl, Greta, who is doing so much for the environment.
Your question, ma'am.
But yes, but what struck me was that when Greta went to the United States to talk about it, Mr. Trump, and not only Mr. Trump, I've seen a number of videos on YouTube and the internet which called Greta a little girl, and she should be back in school because she doesn't know what is going on in the world. So there is this effort to silence the voice of protest for climate change. I want to ask, why do you think that this myopic vision of the future exists? Why are governments so afraid of talking about climate change?
Are we taking many questions together?
Just one more, and then we'll answer it together. There's a guy at the back. You must accept my apology that not every question can be taken in an Amitav Ghosh session because there are several. Yes, one more question? Yes.
Yeah. Hi, sir.
Hi.
So Tipu and Pia returned back in The Great Derangement. So was it a sequel to Hungry Tide? Was it an effort you made to make it a sequel?
Okay, so these two questions, I
Yes,
think?
so you start with Tipu and Pia, and then you can go back to the question the lady asked.
You know, when I started writing Gun Island, I had no idea of having Tipu and Pia in it. So it was absolutely not a sequel. But as I said, you know, characters are not, they're not puppets. They have their own way of asserting themselves. And, you know, they found their way back into my narrative. Sometimes despite myself, I would say. So, but it was wonderful actually to have them back. Because they again, I mean, you know,
So that's
relating
the
to that
happy
other
part
question.
of being an author, yes.
That's right.
Meeting an old character in a new novel.
Yeah, they can come back. On the other question on why are people so dependent on, look, we live in a civilization that is completely founded on fossil fuels. Every light that's on here is because of fossil fuels. You came here in a car that was powered by fossil fuels. Everything that is happening here is due to fossil fuels. And in your generation, most of all, this is true. I mean, say people who grew up when I grew up, we had like, you know, we had a lot of experience of living without power, you know, especially in this city. And, you know, we managed, I wouldn't say perfectly well, but we certainly knew how to manage. I think you would not know how to manage. So just think about it. You know, it's again this question. Fossil fuels are not easily dispensed with. They exercise a kind of hypnotism of their own. And certainly they exercise this hypnotism most of all in a country like in the, what we might call the settler colonial economies, Canada, the US, and Australia, which are countries that are absolutely built on the automobile, you know, and on roads. The US literally could not work without cars. So we should not be in any way, we should not deny the magnitude of this challenge because it means changing entire ways of life.
We can take one more question, I'm told, and then, yes.
There are 3 hands.
There are
4
3 hands. Okay, we've been very partial
no,
to the
guy
back.
at the back has been asking.
Okay, one gentleman at the back,
Yeah,
yes.
well, we can have, we can
We'll
pass
again
the
do
mic.
a couple, yes.
I do, yes. It's a lovely sound. Sorry.
The mic, can you just shout it till we get a mic? You can shout, don't be so, there are many people shouting, outshout them. একটু সামনে আসুন একটা মাইক পেলে ভালো হয় হ্যাঁ বলুন
এক্সকিউজ মি রাস্তাটা ছাড়ো এখানে তো জ্যাম
being sanctioned, 400 crores being sanctioned for clearing and cleaning up and bringing the Saraswati back to life. And Bonbibi, very interestingly, Monusha Mongol is from my part of the world. And Chand Shadagar, Chander Ghat, Chander Nagor, which is Chanda and Nagor. So all of that is from my part of the world. And this is long before Kali Kshetra would come into prominence as the main nerve center for trade and all. I mean, is there, my query is, did anybody ever care to write about the Saraswati Riverscape, which is the most important trade route for the Portuguese and everyone else, and also for us to travel to western parts of the world like Kashi? So, did anybody ever care to mention it? Because Ishwar Chandra, a 30-year-old man, would take a boat and go and establish a school for training
Yeah,
teachers.
so what's your question? Because we'd like to take another
Yeah,
one.
sorry. Just that, did anybody even care, or is anybody writing about it? You would know, because I'm very interested as a collector of songs. Politics is not my business. Thank you.
Well, I think what you're doing is wonderful. We must collect these songs. We must collect, as we head towards this increasingly uncertain world, we have to ask ourselves, what remains, and we have to try and preserve what little remains of the worlds that we once knew. But whether anyone has written about the Saraswati River, I can't tell you. I don't know.
Okay, and this lady who's been very patiently waiting
Yes.
in the front.
The question is, did I always want to become a writer? And the answer is yes. I think as far as back as I can remember, that's what I wanted to do. Well, I started writing when I was in school and so on. I wrote a lot. So I've been doing it for a long, long time. Yeah.
And may you continue to do it for a long, long time. This is the beauty of literature. One can hear clamorous sounds outside. One can hear the wondrous worlds which Amitav keeps telling us about, the gigantic concerns he frightens us with. And of course, we're all looking forward to Jongol Nama. I still would like this festival to claim some of the breaking news. How many of you heard about Jongol Nama for the first time today? Yes, I stand vindicated. So thank you so much, Amitav, and looking forward to the double header in 2020. And how many of you want him back in 2021? It's our 10th year at the Kolkata Literary Meet. Okay. I think the eyes have it. So thank you so much, Amitav. It's always a pleasure. Amitav will try to sign books at some place here. So we'll just follow him around. We'll create a little signing spot, but he'll only sign books. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Quick announcement, no entry or exit from the East Gate. All exits to be from North Gate. That's a very important announcement. Please keep that in mind. No signing at the festival bookstore. Mr. Ghosh will be available to sign books for his second session, and we'll try and create, as Mala said, a little spot here, maybe, but only books. Please wait, and please cooperate with the volunteers who will guide you should we be able to manage a spot. If you can please ask the CISF people. Thank you so much. The North Gate is somewhere to the north. And it is time for our next session, Awakening Bharat Mata.